Okay. So just a reminder, if possible, if you can mute until just before you read, that would be best. Uh, so for those who will be watching this on YouTube later, we're continuing our reading of the stories from the Dubliners. We've been reading them in order, and today we will begin with the story After the Race. And here we go. The cars came scudding in towards Dublin, running evenly like pellets in the groove of the Naas road. At the crest of the hill at Inchicore, sightseers had gathered in clumps to watch the cars careening homeward, and through this channel of poverty and inaction, the continent sped its wealth and industry. Now and again, the clumps of people raised the cheer of the gratefully oppressed. Their sympathy, however, was for the blue cars, the cars of their friends, the French. The French, however, were virtual victors. Their team had finished solidly. They had been placed second and third, and the driver of the winning German car was reported as a Belgian. Each blue car, therefore, received a double measure of welcome as it topped the crest of the hill, and each cheer of welcome was acknowledged with smiles and nods by those in the car. Joan, you need to turn on your mic, Tom.
In one of these trimly built cars was a party of four young men whose spirits seemed to be at present well above the level of successful, how would you pronounce it, Gallicism. In fact, these four young men were almost hilarious. They were Charles Seguin, the owner of the car, Andre Riviere, a young electrician of Canadian birth, a huge Hungarian named Villona, and a neatly groomed young man named Doyle. Seguin was in good humor because he had unexpectedly received some orders in advance. He was about to start a motor establishment in Paris, and Riviere was in good humor because he was to be appointed manager of the establishment. These two young men, who were cousins, were also in good humor because of the success of the French cars. Villona was in good humor because he had had a very satisfactory luncheon and because he was an optimist by nature. The fourth member of the party, however, was too excited to be genuinely happy. Next, please.
He was about 26 years of age, with a soft, light brown moustache and rather innocent looking grey eyes. His father, who had begun life as an advanced nationalist, had modified his views early. He had made his money as a butcher in Kingstown, and by opening shops in Dublin and in the suburbs, he had made his money many times over. He had also been fortunate enough to secure some of the police contracts, and in the end, he had become rich enough to be alluded to in the Dublin newspapers as a merchant prince. He had sent his son to England to be educated in a big Catholic college and had afterwards sent him to Dublin University to study law. Jimmy did not study very earnestly and took to bad courses for a while. He had money and he was popular, and he divided his time curiously between musical and motoring circuits. Then he had been sent for a term to Cambridge to see a little life. His father, remonstrative but covertly proud of the excess, had paid his bills and brought him home. It was at Cambridge that he had met Seguin. They were not much more than acquaintances as yet, but Jimmy found great pleasure in the society of one who had seen so much of the world and was reputed to own some of the biggest hotels in France. Such a person, as his father agreed, was well worth knowing, even if he had not been the charming companion he was. Bellona was entertaining also, brilliant pianist, but unfortunately very poor. The car ran on merrily with its cargo of hilarious youth. The two cousins sat on the front seat. Jimmy and his Hungarian friend sat behind. Decidedly, Bellona was in excellent spirits. He kept up a deep bass hum of melody from miles up the road. The Frenchmen flung their laughter and light words over their shoulders, and often Jimmy had to strain forward to catch the quick phrase. This was not altogether pleasant for him, as he had nearly always to make a deft guess at the meaning and shout back a suitable answer in the teeth of high wind. Besides, Bellona's humming would confuse anybody. The noise of the car, too. Next, please.
Rapid motion through space elates one. So does notoriety. So does the possession of money. These were three good reasons for Jimmy's excitement. He'd been seen by many of his friends that day in the company of these Continentals. At the control, Seguin had presented him to one of the French competitors, and in answer to his confused murmur of compliment, the swarthy face of the driver had disclosed a line of shining white teeth. It was pleasant after that honour to return to the profane world of spectators, amid nudges and significant looks. Then, as to money, he really had a great sum under his control. Seguin, perhaps, would not think of it as a great sum, but Jimmy, who, in spite of temporary errors, was at heart the inheritor of solid instincts, knew well with what difficulty it had been got together. This knowledge had previously kept his bills within the limits of reasonable recklessness, and he had been so conscious of the labour latent in the money when there had been question merely of some freak of higher intelligence. How much more so now when he was about to stake the greater part of his substance? It was a serious thing for him. Next.
Of course, the investment was a good one, as Seguin had managed to give the impression that it was by a favour of friendship the mite of Irish money was to be included in the capital of the concern. Jimmy had a respect for his father's shrewdness in business matters, and in this case it had been his father who had first suggested the investment. Money to be made in the motor business, pots of money. Moreover, Seguin had the unmistakable air of wealth. Jimmy set out to translate into days' works that lordly car in which he sat. How smoothly it ran, in what style they had come careering along the country roads. The journey laid a magical finger on the genuine pulse of life, and gallantly the machinery of human nerves strove to answer the boundary courses of the swift blue animal. They drove down Dame Street. The street was busy with unusual traffic, loud with the horns of motorists and the gongs of impatient tram drivers. Near the bank, Seguin drew up and Jimmy and his friend alighted. A little knot of people collected on the footpath to pay homage to the snorting motor. The party was to dine together that evening in Seguin's hotel, and meanwhile Jimmy and his friend who was staying with him were to go home to dress. The car steered out slowly from Grafton Street, while the two young men pushed their way through the knot of gazers. They walked northward with a curious feeling of disappointment in the exercise, while the city hung its pale globes of light above them in a haze of summer evening. Next, please.
In Jimmy's house, this dinner had been pronounced an occasion. A certain pride mingled with his parents' trepidation, a certain eagerness also to play fast and loose, for the names of great foreign cities have at least this virtue. Jimmy, too, looked very well when he was dressed, and as he stood in the hall giving a last equation to the bows of his dress tie, his father may have felt even commercially satisfied at having secured for his son qualities often unpurchasable. His father, therefore, was unusually friendly with Bellona, and his manner expressed a real respect for foreign accomplishments. But this subtlety of his host was probably lost upon the Hungarian, who was beginning to have a sharp desire for his dinner. Next, please.
But the dinner was excellent, exquisite. Sigun, Jimmy decided, had a very refined taste. The party was increased by a young Englishman named Ruth, whom Jimmy had seen with Sigun at Cambridge. The young men supped in a snug room lit by electric candle lamps. They talked volubly and with little reserve. Jimmy, whose imagination was kindling, conceived the lively youth of the Frenchmen entwined elegantly upon the firm framework of the Englishman's manner. A graceful image of his, he thought, and a just one. He admired the dexterity with which their host directed the conversation. The 5 young men had various tastes, and their tongues had been loosened. Bellona, with immense respect, began to discover to the mildly surprised Englishman the beauties of the English madrigal, deploring the loss of old instruments. Reverie, not wholly ingeniously, undertook to explain to Jimmy the triumph of the French mechanicians. The resonant voice of the Hungarian was about to prevail in ridicule of the spurious lutes of the Romantic painters when Sigun shepherded his party into politics. Here was congenial ground for all. Jimmy, under generous influences, felt the buried zeal of his father wake to life within him. He aroused the torpid Ruth at last. The room grew doubly hot, and Sigun's task grew harder each moment. There was even danger of personal spite. The alert host, at an opportunity, lifted his glass to humanity, and when the toast had been drunk, he threw open a window significantly. Susan.
That night the city wore the mask of a capital. The 5 young men strolled along Stephen's Green in a faint cloud of aromatic smoke. They talked loudly and gaily, and their cloaks dangled from their shoulders. The people made way for them. At the corner of Grafton Street, a short fat man was putting 2 handsome ladies on a car in charge of another fat man. The car drove off, and the short fat man caught sight of the party. "Andre, it's Farley." A torrent of talk followed. Farley was an American. No one knew very well what the talk was about. Bellona and Riviere were the noisiest, but all the men were excited. They got up in a car, squeezing themselves together amid much laughter. They drove by the crowd, blended now into soft colours, to music of merry bells. They took the train at Westland Row, and in a few seconds, as it seemed to Jimmy, they were walking out of Kingston Station. The ticket collector saluted Jimmy. He was an old man. "Fine night, sir." It was a serene summer night. The harbour lay like a darkened mirror at their feet. They proceeded towards it with linked arms, singing Cadet Roussel in the chorus, stamping their feet at every ho, 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 hey, vraiment. They got into a rowboat at the slip and made out for the American's yacht. There was to be supper, music, cards. Bellona said with conviction, "It is delightful." Next, please.
There was a yacht piano in the cabin. Bellona played a waltz for Farley and Riviere, Farley acting as cavalier and Riviere as the lady. Then an impromptu square dance, the men devising original figures. What merriment! Jimmy took his part with a will. This was seeing life at least. Then Farley got out of breath and cried, "Stop!" A man brought in a light supper, and the young men sat down to it for form's sake. They drank, however. It was bohemian. They drank Ireland, England, France, Hungary, the United States of America. Jimmy made a speech, a long speech, Villanova saying, "Here, here," whenever there was a pause. There was a great clapping of hands when he sat down. It must have been a good speech. Farley clapped him on the back and laughed loudly. What jovial fellows! What good company they were! Cards, cards! The table was cleared. Bellona returned quietly to his piano and played voluntaries for them. The older men played game after game, flinging themselves boldly into the adventure. They drank the health of the Queen of Hearts and the Queen of Diamonds. Jimmy felt obscurely the lack of an audience. The wit was flashing. Play ran very high and began to pass Jimmy. Jimmy began to pass. Jimmy did not know exactly who was winning, but he knew that he was losing. But it was his own fault, for he frequently mistook his cards, and the other men had to calculate his IOUs for him. They were devils of fellows, but he wished they would stop. It was getting late. Someone gave the toast of the yacht, the Belle Newport, and then someone proposed one great game for a finish. Next.
The piano had stopped. Vilona must have gone up on deck. It was a terrible game. They stopped just before the end of it to drink for luck. Jimmy understood that the game lay between Ruth and Seguin. What excitement. Jimmy was excited too. He would lose, of course. How much had he written away? Joan. Microphone.
The men rose. Where am I?
Men rose to
Oh, the men rose to their feet to play the last tricks, talking and just gesticulating. Ruth won. The cabin shook with the young men's cheering, and the cards were bundled together. They began then to gather in what they had won. Farley and Jimmy were the heaviest losers. He knew that he would regret it in the morning, but at present he was glad of the rest, glad of the dark stupor that would cover up his folly. He leaned his elbows on the table and rested his head between his hands, counting the beats of his temples. The cabin door opened, and he saw the Hungarian standing in the shaft of gray light. Daybreak, gentlemen.
Okay.
It's a happy story.
Well,
I have a note.
Go ahead.
I have a note in my book. Not a good story. Perhaps should have been omitted. Now, I don't know where that came from. That was not from me.
Okay, you didn't write that in. Oh.
No.
Well, I think
But
it is the least popular, isn't it?
You think what, Susan?
I think it's the least popular one.
Oh, yeah.
Is that right? Okay.
I've heard that said before.
It's still got. I always think, Joyce planned another book beside Dubliners to be called Provincials, if my memory serves the title correct. Yeah. And I imagine that that's a story that belongs in Provincials.
Yeah.
Okay. I've actually, I maybe I unconsciously realized that this story is very apropos for our earlier discussion about company towns, etc.
Yes, yes.
And does anybody else have Formula One in their town? Formula races?
No.
Well, I'm just up the road from the Gordon Bennett road, so you know that's mentioned in Ulysses. And do you all know that that Joyce, when he was in Paris, that he interviewed a driver in the Gordon Bennett race. So if you Google thedrive.com, James Joyce, and yeah, I think it was for the Irish Times, but he wasn't very well prepared. It's not a great interview at all. He obviously had no real interest in cars.
Someone said he was well advised not to get into becoming a sports correspondent.
Exactly.
I think, but there's a lot here. I mean, there's a lot just in terms of basing it in the actual fact of the car race. From my book, there was a car race. They went. It took 6.5 hours to complete. There were 12 entries. There were many entries, but only 12 actually went up to the starting line. The race took place in Ireland because they could map out the track through the open fields or the small towns. It was like permitted for them to cut through wherever in order to get this racetrack underway. It was extensive.
Yes.
Yeah, it was extensive.
Just on
And,
Duncan's point there, sorry, Susan, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, it's okay. I was just getting rid of
Oh,
dogs
just on
earlier.
Duncan's point there, they used to have motor car racing in Phoenix Park in the 70s and 80s, and they brought Grand Prix cars over. They weren't racing the Grand Prix cars, but they actually brought them over, and some of the top Grand Prix drivers drove there through the Phoenix Park, and it was a regular kind of. It was Formula 3, I think, or Formula 2, and yeah, they used to have them up in the park. But the interview with that Joyce did in Paris, like he describes how he tried to get an interview with Fournier, and he was a very hard man to get an interview with, and Joyce had to try about 2 or 3 times, and he eventually went in and he was looking around him and he was waiting for Fournier, and all the cars were there. But yeah, so they got into a kind of discussion about how fast the cars would be going, and at one stage Fournier asked Joyce about the difference between kilometers and miles, and he said to him, how many kind of yards in the mile? He said 1,760. Joyce said, off the top of my head, you know, and they began to kind of break it down into kilometers. Yeah, so it was a story. He shortly after he had the interview, he got the famous telegram from his father, which said, "Come home, mother dying," and he returned to Ireland in sometime in April 1903, and the race took place I think the following July. Joyce didn't bother going, and they had practice rounds after the race and so forth, so he just wrote it out of memory, really. And but yeah, going back to the kind of thing he said, it was, he wanted to really look at it again, but he didn't get the time. But he thought it was one of the 2 worst stories in Dubliners himself. So anyway, yeah, that's it. He kind of, yeah.
Does
But he does capture the parents' efforts to educate their son and to place him in a middle class or upper class position. And it hadn't been easy for them to create the business they had with the butchery, and they were lucky they got the big contracts to serve the constabulary. So, you know, but Jimmy is not, what do they say? The elevator doesn't go to the top. He's not very smart. And
No, he definitely isn't.
yeah, he's groomed more than smart.
yeah,
And and don't you think that this was all a setup anyway between the 2 Frenchmen to try and exploit the situation? They knew, well, because he meets Seguin at Cambridge.
yeah.
Cambridge would have been like a finishing school for him in a way, a credential he had to have, but he doesn't graduate from Cambridge. He just goes there for a semester. But it seems like it was a setup that the 2 Frenchmen were going to go after the money that he had access to in order to set up their own car dealership.
Yeah.
I've got a photograph that we got from the great James Joyce Centre course of the Gordon Bennett race in 1903. If I'm permitted, am I allowed, Duncan, to share screen?
Oh yes.
Will I do that? Just look at Ireland in this photograph if it comes true. Here I go.
Hold on, let's see if I make sure.
Yeah.
Share whiteboards. Hold on, Joe. I'm
It's okay. Yeah.
to get my memory back of.
Yeah, no, I'm not allowed according to this. So but because waiting for you.
It didn't. Okay, I know there's a way that I can do this.
Not to worry, you've probably upset all your settings in other places.
No. It's okay. Last time I tried it, it was very easy. I just went allow everybody to share. Okay.
My book is illustrated with races between cars and donkey carts.
Mm.
Oh, here we go. Your co-host, Joe.
It was a theme for writers around that time, what the motor car would do.
Sure.
And does anyone remember The Wind in the Willows?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Mr. Toad had become
Mr.
obsessed with
Toad
motor
and
cars,
the
and
characters.
Noel Ratty and who is it? Ledger, is it? we're trying to persuade him not to be taken by motor cars.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. Joe, you might try the share screen now since I made you.
Oh, yes, here we go. Share. Any
Okay.
look?
Accent.
Ah, there you
Oh,
Right.
Oh my.
Look at Ireland.
Yeah, see, that would just bowl the locals over.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just so exciting. And as far as the guys, the Continentals taking advantage of Jimmy, I don't even think that they would have been conscious of taking advantage of him.
Yeah.
Is what I was saying. When the Formula One came to Austin, I think 5 or 6 years ago. This is a big international thing with the Saudis come and the Europeans come and the Asians come. And I have a number of local friends who are into that sort of thing,
Yeah.
and they're just like Jimmy.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're just so excited that they're going to get to hang out, with these flashy cars and
Yeah.
with these rich people.
Yeah.
That the story rings incredibly true to me.
Mm-hmm.
Just from my,
Yeah.
I didn't go, but just from the little echoes that I hear of it. And I'm sure the same thing was true there. I mean, when you're from the fancier culture, particularly money and all that, and culture wise, it's amazing what the locals will do.
Yeah. But it's also kind of it's an image of imperialism. You see the imperial powers in the yacht playing cards.
Mm-hmm.
And there are cartoons of Hungary and Germany and France and England carving up a pie, of the Ottoman Empire and all that sort of, they must be playing cards for parts of the empire type of thing. I'll stop sharing that now, and hopefully.
Joe, can you read the text that goes along with the picture or not?
It's difficult to read, but among the other things they gave us was that interview from a correspondent, which is Mr. Joyce, but it just says a correspondent. But it's impossible to make out the text on the screen here, so I doubt sharing it would improve it. It'd probably worsen it. But it's kind of interesting to.
Mm-hmm.
It's like watching your favorite team losing 1-0, watching Joyce writing about motor racing in the Irish Times. But then, as Tom says, he was probably done it from memory. Which makes
Joyce's concern, as he expressed it in that interview, was that these cars would be too hard on the Irish roads.
Well,
and he mentioned that, and when you look at that picture that you showed there, Joe, those were dirt tracks, those were roads.
Yeah, that's it. We're a bit better now, a bit better.
Yeah, the European money was great.
Yeah,
I went off on a tangent about the Hungarian friend because the father had moderated his views, and Arthur Griffith had written The Resurrection of Hungary, and it had been published in 1904.
Yeah.
So I don't know where that fits in with Dubliners and the Hungarian friend. So surprisingly, I read the story before we came in and looked up Arthur Griffith and The Resurrection of Hungary and the idea of dual monarchies.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's an undercurrent that Jimmy's friend is the Hungarian dual monarchy, and the whole concept of early Sinn Féin versus later on.
Mm.
Because, well, that's just what I was getting from this. And And the French at the beginning, what are the French? The French are the big Republicans.
Yes.
And I don't think America was considered to be an empire until Roosevelt stood on some mountain in the Philippines, and I can't remember what date that was. But I don't think that America even considered themselves to be an empire or anything of the sort early on, because they thought that they were still the living embodiment of the Republican ideal.
Mhm.
So you've got them all represented.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the position of the American is exactly correct, because it wasn't really until after the two world wars. After the First World War, I mean, America made a ton of money off the First World War. And Europe was so devastated at the end of the war that Wilson could go in and kind of throw his weight around a little bit. And then with the Second World War, America geared up its industry so high, and we took relatively few casualties.
Yeah. But you have the atomic bomb then as well. And
The thing is, just towards the end, where he says that Jimmy and Farley were the biggest losers in the game of cards, you know?
yeah.
Yeah.
It ties in with Orla's. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Joyce makes an interesting political point. Sorry, Tom, at the very start.
Yeah.
In
the
first
very first paragraph, going back to Joe's picture, it says, and through this channel of poverty and inaction, the continent sped its wealth and industry, you know? So here were the Irish spectators out in kind of poverty and inaction, and this was the razzmatazz of the continent speeding through,
But he also refers to the favourites in this race, that certainly the French were favoured by the Irish spectators. They talk about the cars of their friends, the French. And of course, that has a great resonance in Irish history, where the French were always going to come in and boot the British out.
Yeah. But the car that wins is a Mercedes. Now, was that a German car?
Yeah.
Yeah, they said so it's the team, the second and third one are the French in the race.
Yeah.
There you go.
Which, just in terms of common thought, I mean, the Germans were always the technical people. They were the leading technologist. Well, the French were always been the leaders in cultural things, fashion, all this sort of thing. At least that's the impression that I get. I mean, you know, when I was in Holland, I remember a conversation with some Dutch physicians, and I was a guinea pig in one of their medical research studies, and they were making a joke about the Germans, and the joke was that if a German gets lost in the deep woods, it won't be too long before they'll drive out in a railroad car, a railroad engine made of wood and powered by steam. The idea being that, you know, the Germans are very good at all the technical stuff. But
Vorsprung dark technique.
So in portrait, isn't there a phrase? Someone shouts "Made in Germany," and the footnote says this was, German industry was regarded as third rate at this time. In the way that in the 1950s, you know, goods made in Japan were regarded as very bad. But you know, like the very quickly changed, because it means they're working on it because they have to. And suddenly the Japanese were the best in the world at re-engineering things. And The same Germany went through the same process. The British talked down to them, and that guy, I think, is in the university. Someone shouts "made in Germany." That's a term of abuse. I can't remember the circumstances.
So many of the German scientists came to America after the war.
Yeah.
And what's the one that put us on the moon? He was the one that was developing all the rockets for Germany.
Yeah.
And came in.
Von Braun.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
his work put us on the moon in the
Yeah.
60s, 69.
Yeah, and that's what the Russians used to say, that they got better Germans than we got.
Yeah.
Doing the same
Oh,
thing.
Yeah, the Dulles brothers were right there during the entire Second World War,
Yeah.
looking to see who they were going to grab at the end of the war.
Yeah.
And actually were doing some business during the war. The Dulles brothers being Alan Dulles with the CIA, and his brother, I forget, was one of the biggest law firms out of New York. And, you know, they're very active there. So between the Jewish scientists that came over before and during the war, and then the German scientists,
and even they were Nazis too.
Oh yeah, a lot of
they had to be in order to keep the jobs in Germany.
Yeah, in order to keep themselves from being prosecuted.
Yeah.
Yes.
And because Germany also was devastated, a lot of German scientists came to the United States at that time.
They cut a deal.
Yeah.
Kind of disquieting, though, isn't it, that you know, people that were so criminal are welcomed by our country. I mean, we did benefit, but they were
money talks.
Yeah, and the governments
money and
collude.
Technical skill talks. Big time. Yeah.
This opening paragraph.
I think it was about money. I think it was about the next war, because you know, even before the war was over, the Second World War was over, the sides had been split as to, you know, the East-West divide. So they knew what was coming. So they tried to grab as many people as they could that could help with what was going to happen afterwards.
Yeah.
And so I really don't think it had to do with money, rather than what are we going to do when the next one happens? Or if the next one happens, or how do we avert the next one? How do we get ahead in the race?
Yes.
And I think that happens with all like carving up of commodities and everything, because they're going, we have to be ready for the next one.
Well, the Americans had Oppenheimer for the next one.
That's right.
I think we may be losing scientists now to Canada. At least that's what my friends in Canada are saying. That I don't want to say why I think, because I really don't know. But I think maybe there are a lot of people these days in the United States that don't believe in science. I think that happened during the pandemic.
Yeah, and they may be concerned, but I would suspect that that's not a huge number, except for foreign scientists. They're worried about.
You can't answer that. Yeah.
Growing xenophobia, but I think that even in this story, which I think someone said Joyce himself considered this not one of the better stories, really does cover a lot of territory. Though.
Yes, I agree.
And even if he was not a sports reporter or race car reporter, he did a good job on getting the psychology pretty pat. Yeah. Shall we proceed to the two gallants?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, so the last reader, I think so. Joan, you were the last reader. I
Yes.
think Donna, you would be starting 2 gallants, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. Shall I proceed?
Proceed, sir.
Okay. 2 gallants. The grey, warm evening of August had descended upon the city, and the mild, warm air, a memory of summer, circulated in the streets. The streets, shuttered for the repose of Sunday, swarmed with a gaily coloured crowd. Like illumined pearls and the lamps shone from the summits of their tall poles upon the living texture below, which, changing shape and hue unceasingly, sent up into the warm grey evening air an unchanging, unceasing murmur. 2 young men came down the hill of Rutland Square. One of them was just bringing a long monologue to a close. The other, who walked on the verge of the path and was at times obliged to step onto the road, owing to his companion's rudeness, wore an amused, listening face. He was squat and ruddy, a yachting cap was shoved far back from his forehead, and the narrative to which he listened made constant waves of expression break forth over his face from the corners of his nose and eyes and mouth. Little jets of wheezing laughter followed one another out of his convulsed body. His eyes, twinkling with cunning enjoyment, glanced at every moment towards his companion's face. Once or twice, he rearranged the light waterproof which he had slung over one shoulder in toreador fashion. His breeches, his white rubber shoes, and his jauntily slung waterproof expressed youth. But his figure fell into rotundity at the waist. His hair was scant and grey, and his face, when the waves of expression had passed over it, had a ravaged look. Next, please.
When he was quite sure, sorry, when he was quite sure that the narrative had ended, he laughed noisily for fully half a minute. Then he said, "Well, that takes the biscuit." His voice seemed winnowed of vigour, and to enforce his words, he added with humour, "That takes the solitary, unique, and if I may call it, the recherche biscuit." He became serious and silent when he had said this. His tongue was tired, for he had been talking all the afternoon in the public house in Dorset Street. Most people considered Lenihan a leech, but in spite of this reputation, his adroitness and eloquence had always prevented his friends from forming any general policy against him. He had a brave manner of coming up to a party of them in a bar, and of holding himself nimbly at the borders of the company until he was included in a round. He was a sporting vagrant armed with a vast stock of stories, limericks, and riddles. He was insensitive to all kinds of discourtesy. No one knew how he achieved the stern task of living, but his name was vaguely associated with racing issues. "Where did you pick her up, Corley?" he asked. Corley ran his tongue swiftly along his upper lip. Next.
"One night, man," he said, "I was going along Dame Street and I spotted a fine tart under Waterhouse clock and said, 'Good night,' you know. So we went for a walk round by the canal, and she told me she was a slavey in a house in Baggot Street. I put my arm round her and squeezed her a bit that night. Then next Sunday I met her by appointment. We went out to Donnybrook and I brought her into the field there. She told me she used to go with a dairyman. He was fine, man. Cigarettes every night she'd bring me and paying the tram out and back. And one night she bought me 2 bloody fine cigars. Oh, the real cheese, you know. And the old fella used to smoke. I was afraid, man, she'd get in the family way. But she's up to the dodge. Maybe she thinks you'll marry her," said Lenihan. "I told her I was out of a job," said Corley. I told her I was in Pimm's. She doesn't know my name. I was too hairy to tell her that. But she thinks I'm a bit of a class, you know. Lenihan laughed again noiselessly. Of all the good ones ever I heard, he said, that emphatically takes the biscuit. Next, please.
Corley's stride acknowledged the compliment. The swing of his burly body made his friend execute a few light skips from the path to the roadway and back again. Corley was the son of an inspector of police, and he had inherited his father's frame and gait. He walked with his hands by his sides, holding himself erect and swaying his head from side to side. His head was large, globular, and oily. It sweated in all weathers, and his large round hat, set upon it sideways, looked like a bulb which had grown out of another. He always stared straight before him as if he was on parade, and when he wished to gaze after someone in the street, it was necessary for him to move his body from the hips. At present, he was about town. Whenever any job was vacant, a friend was always ready to give him the hard word. He was often to be seen walking with policemen in plain clothes, talking earnestly. He knew the inner side of all affairs and was fond of delivering final judgments. He spoke without listening to the speech of his companions. His conversation was mainly about himself, what he had said to such a person and what such a person had said to him, and what he had said to settle the matter. When he reported these dialogues, he aspirated the first letter of his name, after the manner of Florentine. Next, please.
Lenihan offered his friend a cigarette. As the two young men walked on through the crowd, Corley occasionally turned to smile at some of the passing girls, but Lenihan's gaze was fixed on the large, faint moon circled with a double halo. He watched earnestly the passing of the grey web of twilight across its space. At length he said, "Well, tell me, Corley, I suppose you'll be able to pull it off all right, eh?" Corley closed one eye expressively as an answer. "Is she game for that?" asked Lenihan dubiously. "Look, I never know women." "She's all right," said Corley. "I know the way to get round her, man. She's a bit gone on me." "You're what I call a gay Lothario," said Lenihan, "and a proper kind of a Lothario, too." A shade of mockery relieved the servility of his manner. To save himself, he had the habit of leaving his flattery open to interpretation of raillery. But Corley had not a supple mind. Susan.
"There's nothing to touch a good slavey," he affirmed. "Take my tip for it. By one who has tried them all," said Lenihan. "First I used to go with girls, you know," said Corley, unbosoming. "Girls off the South Circular. I used to take them out, man, on the tram somewhere and pay the tram, or take them to a band or a play at the theatre, or buy them chocolate and sweets or something that way. I used to spend money on them right enough," he added in a convincing tone, as if he was conscious of being disbelieved. But Lenihan could well believe it. He nodded gravely. "I know that game," he said, "and it's a mug's game." "A damned thing I ever got out of it," said Corley. "Ditto here," said Lenihan. "Only off one of them," said Corley. He moistened his upper lip by running his tongue along it. The recollection brightened his eyes. He too gazed at the pale disk of the moon, now nearly veiled, and seemed to meditate. "She was a bit of all right," he said regretfully. He was silent again. Then he added, "She's on the turf now. I saw her driving down Earl Street one night with two fellas with her on a car." "I suppose that's your doing," said Lenihan. "There was others at her before me," said Corley philosophically. This time Lenihan was inclined to disbelieve. He shook his head to and fro and smiled. Next, please.
"You know you can't kid me, Corley," he said. "Honest to God," said Corley. "Didn't she tell me herself?" Lenihan made a tragic gesture. "Base betrayer," he said. As they passed along the railings of Trinity College, Lenehan skipped out into the road and peered up at the clock. 20 after, he said. Time enough, said Corley. She'll be there all right. I always let her wait a bit. Lenehan laughed quietly. Ecod, Corley, you know how to take them, he said. I'm up to all their little tricks, Corley confessed. But tell me, said Lenehan again, are you sure you can bring it off all right? You know, it's a ticklish job. They're damn close on that point. Eh? What? His bright small eyes searched his companion's face for reassurance. Corley swung his head to and fro, as if to toss aside an insistent insect, and his brows gathered. I'll pull it off, he said. Leave it to me, can't you? Lenehan said no more. He did not wish to ruffle his friend's temper, to be sent to the devil and told that his advice was not wanted. A little tact was necessary. But Corley's brow was soon smooth again. His thoughts were running another way. She's a fine, decent tart, he said, with appreciation. That's what she is. Next. Duncan, you mute.
Thank you. Walked along Nassau Street and then turned into Kildare Street. Not far from the porch of the club, a harpist stood in the doorway, playing to a little ring of listeners. He plucked at the wires heedlessly, glancing quickly from time to time at the face of each newcomer and from time to time wearily also at the sky. His harp, too, heedless that her coverings had fallen about her knees, seemed weary alike of the eyes of strangers and of her master's hands. One hand played in the bass the melody of Silent O Mori, while the other hand careered in the treble after each group of notes. The notes of the air throbbed deep and full. The two young men walked up the street without speaking. The mournful music followed them. When they reached Stephen's Green, they crossed the road. Here, the voice of trams, the light, and the crowds released them from their silence. There she is, said Corley. At the corner of Hume Street, a young woman was standing. She wore a blue dress and a white sailor hat. She stood on the curbstone, swinging an umbrella in one hand. Lenehan grew lively. Next, please.
Let's have a squint at her, Corley, he said. Corley glanced sideways at his friend, and an unpleasant grin appeared on his face. Are you trying to get inside me? He asked. Damn it, said Lenehan boldly. I don't want an introduction. All I want is to have a look at her. I'm not going to eat her. Oh, a look at her, said Corley more amiably. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll go over and talk to her, and you can pass by. Right, said Lenehan. Corley had already thrown one leg over the chains when Lenehan called out. And after, where will we meet? 10:30, answered Corley, hanging over his other leg. Where? Corner of Marion Street. We'll be coming back. Work it all right now, said Lenehan in farewell. Next, please.
Corley did not answer. He sauntered across the road, swaying his head from side to side. His bulk, his easy pace, and the solid sound of his boots had something of the conqueror in them. He approached the young woman and, without saluting, began at once to converse with her. She swung her sunshade more quickly and executed half-turns on her heels. Once or twice, when he spoke to her at close quarters, she laughed and bent her head. Lenehan observed them for a few minutes. Then he walked rapidly along beside the chains some distance and crossed the road obliquely. As he approached Hume Street corner, he found the air heavily scented, and his eyes made a swift, anxious scrutiny of the young woman's appearance. She had her Sunday finery on. Her blue serge skirt was held at the waist by a belt of black leather. The great silver buckle of her belt seemed to depress the center of her body, catching the light stuff of her white blouse like a clip. She wore a short black jacket with mother-of-pearl buttons and a ragged black boa. The ends of her tulle collarette had been carefully disordered, and a big bunch of red flowers was pinned in her bosom, stems upwards. Lenehan's eyes noted approving her stout, short, muscular body. Frank, rude health glowed in her face, on her fat red cheeks, and in her unabashed blue eyes. Her features were blunt. Next, please.
She had
She had
broad
broad nose. Sorry.
a straggling mouth which lay open in a contented leer, and two projecting front teeth. As he passed Lenehan took off his cap, and after about 10 seconds, Corley returned a salute to the air. This he did by raising his hand vaguely and pensively, changing the angle of the position of his hat. Lenehan walked as far as the Shelburne Hotel, where he halted and waited. After waiting for a little time, he saw them coming towards him, and when they turned to the right, he followed them, stepping lightly in his white shoes down one side of Merrion Square. As he walked on slowly, timing his pace to theirs, he watched Corley's head, which turned at every moment towards the young woman's face, like a big ball revolving on a pivot. He kept the pair in view until he had seen them climbing the stairs of the Donnybrook tram. And he turned about and went back the way he had come. Now that he was alone, his face looked older. His gaiety seemed to forsake him, and as he came by the railings of Duke's Lawn, he allowed his hand to run along them. The air which the harpist had played began to control his movements. His softly padded feet played the melody, while his fingers swept the scale of variations idly along the railings after each group of notes. Next.
He walked listlessly around Stephen's Green and then down Grafton Street. Though his eyes took note of many elements of the crowd through which he passed, they did so morosely. He found trivial all that was meant to charm him, and did not answer the glances which invited him to be bold. He knew that he would have to speak a great deal, to invent and to amuse, and his brain and throat were too dry for such a task. The problem of how he could pass the hours till he met Corley again troubled him a little. He could think of no way of passing them but to keep on walking. He turned to the left when he came to the corner of Rutland Square and felt more at ease in the dark white street. The sombre look of which suited his mood. He paused at last before the window of a poor-looking shop over which the words "Refreshment Bar" were pinned in white letters. On the glass of the window were two flying inscriptions, ginger beer and ginger ale. Cut ham was exposed in a great blue dish, while near it on a plate lay a segment of a very light plum pudding. He eyed this food earnestly for which time, and then, after glancing wearily up and down the street, went into the shop quickly. Next, please.
He was hungry for, except some biscuits which he had asked two grudging curates to bring him. He had eaten nothing since breakfast time. He sat down at an uncovered wooden table opposite two work girls and a mechanic. A slatternly girl waited on him. "How much is a plate of peas?" he asked. "3 halfpence, sir," said the girl. "Bring me a plate of peas," he said, "and a bottle of ginger beer." He spoke roughly in order to belie his air of gentility, for his entry had been followed by a pause of talk. His face was heated. To appear natural, he pushed his cap back on his head and planted his elbows on the table. The mechanic and the two work girls examined him point by point before resuming their conversation in a subdued voice. The girl brought him a plate of grocer's hot peas seasoned with pepper and vinegar, a fork, and his ginger beer. He ate his food greedily and found it so good that he made a note of the shop mentally. When he had eaten all the peas, he sipped his ginger beer and sat for some time thinking of Corley's adventure. In his imagination, he beheld a pair of lovers walking along some dark road. He heard Corley's voice in deep, energetic gallantries, and saw again the leer of the young woman's mouth. The vision made him feel keenly his own poverty of purse and spirit. Next, please.
He was tired of knocking about, of pulling the devil by the tail, of shifts and intrigues. He would be 31 in November. Would he never get a good job? Would he never have a home of his own? He thought how pleasant it would be to have a warm fire to sit by and a good dinner to sit down to. He walked the streets long enough. He had walked the streets long enough with friends and with girls. He knew what those friends were worth. He knew the girls too. Experience had embittered his heart against the world, but all hope had not left him. He felt better after having eaten than he had felt before, less weary of his life, less vanquished in spirit. He might yet be able to settle down into some snug corner and live happily if he could only come across some good, simple-minded girl with a little of the ready. Susan.
He paid twopence halfpenny to the slatternly girl and went out of the shop to begin his wandering again. He went into Capel Street and walked along towards the City Hall. Then he turned into Dame Street. At the corner of George's Street, he met two friends of his and stopped to converse with them. He was glad that he could rest from all his walking. His friends asked him had he seen Corley and what was the latest. He replied that he had spent the day with Corley. His friends talked very little. They looked vacantly after some figures in the crowd and sometimes made a critical remark. One said that he had seen Mac an hour before in Westmoreland Street. At this, Lenihan said that he had been with Mac the night before in Egan's. The young man who had seen Mac in Westmoreland Street asked was it true that Mac had won a bit over a billiard match. Lenihan did not know. He said that Holohan had stood them drinks in Egan's. He left his friends at 9:45 and went up George's Street. He turned to the left at the city markets and walked on into Grafton Street. The crowd of girls and young men had thinned, and on his way up the street he heard many groups and couples bidding one another good night. He went as far as the clock of the College of Surgeons. It was on the stroke of 10. He set off briskly along the northern side of the green, hurrying for fear Corley should return too soon. When he reached the corner of Merrion Street, he took his stand in the shadow of a lamp and brought out one of the cigarettes which he had reserved and lit it. He leaned against the lamp-post and kept his gaze fixed on the part from which he expected to see Corley and the young woman return. Next, please.
His mind became active again. He wondered had Corley managed it successfully. He wondered if he had asked her yet, or if he would leave it to the last. He suffered all the pangs and thrills of his friend's situation, as well as those of his own. But the memory of Corley's slowly revolving head calmed him somewhat. He was sure Corley would pull it off all right. All at once the idea struck him that perhaps Corley had seen her home by another way and given him the slip. His eyes searched the street. There was no sign of them. Yet it was surely half an hour since he had seen the clock up of the College of Surgeons. Would Corley do a thing like that? He lit his last cigarette and began to smoke it nervously. He strained his eyes as each tram stopped at the far corner of the square. They must have gone home by another way. The paper of his cigarette broke, and he flung it into the road with a curse. Next.
Suddenly he saw them coming towards him. He started with delight and kept close to his lamppost, keeping close to his lamppost, tried to read the result of their walk. They were walking quickly, the young woman taking quick, short steps, while Corley kept beside her with his long stride. They did not seem to be speaking. An intimation of the result pricked him like the point of a sharp instrument. He knew Corley would fail. He knew it was no go. They turned down Bagot Street, and he followed them at once, taking the other footpath. When they stopped, he stopped too. They talked for a few minutes, and then the young woman went down the steps into the area of a house. Corley remained standing at the edge of the path, a little distance from the front steps. Some minutes passed. Then the hall door was opened slowly and cautiously. A woman came running down the front steps and coughed. Corley turned and went towards her. His broad figure hid hers from view for a few seconds, and then she reappeared running up the steps. The door closed on her, and Corley began to walk swiftly towards Stephen's Green. Next, please, John. Microphone.
Lenehan hurried on in the same direction. Some stops of light rain fell. He took them as a warning, and glancing back toward the house which the young woman had entered to see that he was not observed, he ran eagerly across the road. Anxiety in his swift run made him pant. He called out, "Hello, Corley." Corley turned his head to see who had called him, and then continued walking as before. Lenehan ran after him, settling the waterproof on his shoulders with one hand. "Hello, Corley," he cried again. He came level with his friend and looked keenly in his face. He could see nothing there. "Well," he said, "did it come off?" They had reached the corner of Ely Place. Still without answering, Corley swerved to the left and went up the side street. His features were composed in stern calm. Lenehan kept up with his friend, breathing uneasily. He was baffled, and a note of menace pierced through his voice. "Can't you tell us?" he said. "Did you try her?" Corley halted at the first lamp and stared grimly before him. Then, with a grave gesture, he extended a hand toward the light and, smiling, opened it slowly to the gait of his disciple. A small gold coin shone in the palm.
Wow.
You can't come up here. Yeah. Oops.
So the idea of the story was for the Corley to hit up the girlfriend for money for the.
Yeah. For her to grow up. Gallants, they're not.
But Lenehan's 31. It's pathetic. It's a story. It's a pathetic story. You know, she's working as a maid in a family home.
I think that's what a slave is.
Yeah. Lenehan's 31. No job.
Yeah, this is one of the stories that gave Joyce most difficulty with the printers and the people that were going to publish it. And he said that he would sacrifice 5 other stories in Dubliners and that he would name them rather than let this one go, because they wanted to omit this one altogether. And that after Ivy Day in the committee room, this was his favorite story, which would not include, he hadn't written The Dead at the time. But it's interesting that Joyce would say that, but it's one of the ones that gave him most problems. And he refused to kind of let it go, yeah.
Why do you think that it's so attached?
I always think of the 5 stories that he would have let go instead. I sometimes.
No, yeah. I was thinking the same as Duncan. Why do you think that, Tom?
Sorry?
Why this story?
Why do you think this is the one?
I don't know. It must have given them so much satisfaction aesthetically, and to write probably about a world that he knew very well, and this kind of sauntering around, and he said about Dubliners that it had a taste. It would have a taste of ashes about it. About this and the scrupulous meanness that he talked about. So he really was describing a kind of the underbelly of the city that he knew well in his saunters, and these are the characters that he knew, like, you know, and these two, and it's no coincidence that these two turn up again in Ulysses, you know. So yeah, so it's interesting, but I don't know why, but yeah.
Well, it's like it's one thing to be exploited by Britain. It's another thing to see the people exploiting each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or
You kind of think of Lily in The Dead, and what was her line about the men that is now is only all palaver and what they can get out of you.
Yeah.
We've got and we've got this girl who's like, obviously she must be stealing from the family that she works for, you know. So
yeah.
I'm
But
surprised
maybe-
that Joyce allowed them to win in the end. I mean, they get a gold coin, which must have been very valuable. And I don't see how she was going to be able to hide the fact that she had stolen it. So,
Yeah.
you know, as
That's what
Susan
I was
said,
thinking, Donna. She's going to be fired.
she's going to be fired, yeah. And the two boys who are, you know, wasters have this gold coin to drink their faces off for another day, you know. Yeah, I just thought that maybe she would have left him standing or something like that, or whatever. But no, they seem to win in the end.
Well,
And Lenihan didn't even trust Corley.
No,
He's following him around and he's checking what he's doing. No, they weren't
he was
even
sure
nice
that he
people
wouldn't
to
turn
each
up.
other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like Lily, probably this girl also changes her demeanor. She knows she's been exploited, or she has been put to crime on behalf of a boyfriend that's marginal at best.
So
But he hasn't even told her his name.
Yeah.
If I was reading this on my own, I never would have caught that whole thing that she would have stolen the money. I would have just thought for some reason that she handed over some of her wages. So,
but a gold coin would be a different monetary unit than what she would have been paid in, right? I mean, pence and shillings or whatever would be a different middle.
Yeah. I understand now that it's pointed out to me.
Of course, I'm just thinking about Nora and Joyce as well, because, you know, for their date they went off walking and sure, this couple, you know, isn't there talking about them being in the field or whatever, you know. So if you're going out with, if you don't have money to go for dinner or, you know, other respectable things, you know, they're, you know, these girls are obviously very vulnerable to these men, you know.
My notes are saying that the gold coin would have been a sovereign, the only gold coin in use at the time. It was worth 20 shillings. So she certainly wouldn't have been in possession of something like that. The going rate for general servants at this stage would have been between £4 and £8 a year.
A year.
A year. Okay. And she also brought him cigars and
cigarettes. Yeah.
Yeah, awful. They definitely took Gallants anyway, but awful. I don't know.
You can understand Evelyn's father's concerns for her.
Oh, last week, she was going to go away with
in light of Lily and this girl. Do we know her name even? We don't get her name. Sure, we don't.
No, I don't think so.
Names.
Which demeans her even further, doesn't it?
Just ranks her where the lads think she belongs, So,
just going back to what you said about Evelyn, Joe, I was reading some Richard Ellman during the week, and you remember we were debating whether she stayed on the shoreline or went off in the boat, but she stayed, but he stayed too, and they had loads of kids. Apparently they were able to identify who it was.
oh, that's amazing.
So they lived
Really?
happily ever after. Yeah.
That's good to know. Here.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
Just to
Lovely.
brighten up our evening,
Yeah.
excellent.
Has anybody ever heard of Pimm's, where Cordy said that he was working?
That's in Georgia Street, wasn't it? On the corner of Georgia Street and Dane Street it was.
And Bagot Street, yeah.
It was also a drink.
Part of it.
Oh, Pepsi drink. Yeah.
2 M's.
Pimm's number 1, was it, or something? What was the number 1?
There were a number of numbers, Tom.
They're a wealthy family, Stoke brothers and Pimm's.
You could say I'm on Pimm's number 9 now as the night went on.
I really like the thing after Corley went off with the girl and Linehan was on his own.
Yeah.
And the mood that Linehan fell into. I mean, it really displayed the emptiness of Linehan.
Yeah.
That unless he was, interacting with one of his buddies, he didn't have much going for him at all. He wasn't even sure who he was.
And he's still in the same role in Ulysses. He's hanging around with Blazes Boylan, who leaves him standing, or seems to. I don't know whether he gets onto that car with Boylan and then has to hang around outside.
Yeah.
I like the bit about the harp. So on one hand, you got the symbol of Ireland, the harp is playing, and that's kind of very romantic. And then you've got him strumming the railings, so the reality of Dublin as opposed to the romantic Ireland. Bit of a contrast there.
Yeah.
I thought the way that Linehan was viewing the harp was really indicative of what happens, where whatever's happening inside of ourselves tends to be projected on what's going on outside. Even to the extent the harp itself was dejected.
And it was a great description of Linehan hanging around with the crowds until he becomes part of the group that is going to be around a drink for. And didn't he did something similar in the newspaper office, doesn't he? He hangs around with the lighter until he gets a cigarette.
Yeah.
Is that yeah, I'm right there, aren't I? Yeah, that he hangs around. He's just a professional.
Yeah. And Boylan in the hotel tells him what he's going to have. Are you going to have a glass of, what was it, a glass of bitter? Or, he didn't give him a choice. What do you have? He says, will you have a pint of, and it's the cheapest drink on the menu. He buys it.
That's our Lennon.
That's Corley minding the stones, isn't it? For the corporation, the same Corley, is it?
No, Corley isn't Corley the fella that comes and he's looking for somewhere to stay. That he stops. Is that Corley? He stops Stephen on the way back because he's nowhere to stay, and Stephen says it's going to be a job. the next day.
He's looking for a job.
Oh,
Yeah, that's Corley.
Yeah, and he says those
That's
are
what I was
half
thinking.
crowns. Those are half crowns because Stephen didn't look at what he had in his pocket. He thought they were pennies. And
yeah.
So maybe that same argument was the argument that Corley used with the girl. Too.
I think there's great descriptions of the two of them, personal descriptions of the two of them. Joyce's, his ability with words is uncanny, really, when he describes them and their gestures and how they look, and everything is
their manner,
their manner,
shade of mockery relieved the servility of his manner.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's poetry, really.
Yeah, brilliant.
Even Lanahan's cigarette frustrates him, like it breaks him.
Yeah.
Stop it. I think they're predators. Would we agree as a group that we think these pair are predators with their label? No?
Corley is the predator, and Lenehan is a parasite. He's a parasite on the predator.
Yeah, that's the difference. Yeah. He's passive. He's non-active. He's just in on everything, but he doesn't do anything.
That line where he says, he's always hanging around at the edge of the crowd until somebody buys him around. Yeah.
Exactly.
So would Corley have done this if it hadn't been for Lenehan? I think Lenehan kept urging him to get the money. I'm not sure Corley would have taken that money or put the girl up to it.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I would think that it was actually Lenehan didn't really put him up to it, but Corley also being rather insecure was trying to prove to Lenehan how much power he. So again, at least my view is that Lenehan is passive until Corley comes up with the idea.
Okay.
Well, I've got this girl, and I bet I can get some money out of her. And oh, really? You really think you can do that, Corley? So once Corley puts forth the idea, and would encourage him or question him about it, and Corley wants to prove.
Well, and so he would have charmed her, like the word gallant in the title. He would have charmed her into giving him the money. Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, he wouldn't have put any pressure on her or force or threat.
Well, the implication is that Corley had already talked to the girl, because she didn't. I don't imagine that she went back to the house after he asked her for money, and then came with a gold coin. So she had a coin. She had already decided that she was going to give him some money before they even met that night. Correct me if I'm off base there, but
I thought she went in and took the money for him at the end of the date.
Yeah. She goes in her door, her basement door, and comes out.
Yeah, she went in.
front door
Yeah,
of the house.
I came back out the steps.
okay, good. Thank you, ma'am. You're right. Or you,
And we don't know how old she is, because if Lennon is 30, 31, Corley is probably similar age. This poor child could be
Yeah.
16, 17. We don't know. Completely
Yeah.
innocent.
Yeah.
You know, they'd have an awful lot more living behind them than she would. She'd be very innocent.
well, the description of her mouth when Lenehan passes by, where is that? Where is that? The description of her mouth does not indicate, at least did not indicate to me that she was innocent.
Oh, okay. I just wondered.
Okay, Lenehan observed them for a few minutes and he walked rapidly. As he approached, he found the air heavily scented, and his eyes made a swift, anxious scrutiny of the girl's appearance. She had her Sunday finery on. Up above gives a whole thing of her description. Frank rude health glowed in her face, on her fat red cheeks and her unabashed blue eyes. Features were blunt, broad nostrils, a straggling mouth which lay open in a contented leer. Maybe I'm reading too much into that contented leer. But Corley, at least the description of Corley to me doesn't come across to me as an older man that would be attractive to a young, even though naive girl.
Well, she's no innocent. He says he's afraid she'd get in the family way.
Well, early on, doesn't he say that he took her into a field, implying? Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of you have ever seen the Ballroom of Romance.
Yep. Mm.
The way they go into the field at the
Yeah.
end.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose I should be saying we've all read the William Trevor story, but
yeah.
I've seen Ballroom of Romance, and it's sort of like that's what going into the field.
Yeah. The fabulous story, and yeah.
And that's a William Trevor story?
Yeah.
I think.
Okay. I think Neil Tobin was in the film, was he?
I only saw the RTE version.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
They made
it. Yeah.
Mm. It's just I watched it with my mother. My mother was saying, "I used to love those dances. I used to love those dances in the lemonade." It doesn't show it in the best light. I haven't read the story, so I should. That'll be on our reading list.
That would be nice. I'd like to read some William Trevor with you.
Mm.
I didn't know he wrote short stories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's an awful lot of short stories. Yeah.
This is Trevor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Contemporary. Okay, you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, I gotta go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone.
They're very different stories today.
And so next week, 2 stories, do you think?
Hopefully.
Yeah, I haven't counted pages, but probably so. We seem to. Yeah, it looks
Okay.
like boarding house is 8 pages. That's been pretty standard. And little cloud is a little longer. That's 14. Yeah, probably that's a much longer story. Let's see how long is the Gallants. The Gallants was 10 or 11. Well, okay, how about if we just say we might get through 2 stories or we might not.
Okay. Yeah.
Conversation we have after the boarding house. Right.
Okay.
Y'all.